Well, as we continue, we've been looking at the Bible as one big story. The beginning of the Bible, as the beginning of any story, is so important, and that's why we must take a few weeks to look at what Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are saying. So today we return to Genesis 1, and we look at God creating humans. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the seas, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the ground, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. Well, political images are all around us all the time. We're familiar with the style of political propaganda images in communist countries, like that of Chairman Mao, that of Lenin or Stalin, but even that of Che Guevara, who is now ever present on T-shirts. Though democratic or republican societies such as ours have not generally had these iconographic faces of political leaders like our communist and totalitarian brethren, we still use political symbols in our daily life. The American flag is a ubiquitous display of ownership and influence wherever it flies. The intangible presence of political rule is expressed through imagery. There are statues of leaders, like the memorable tearing down of the Saddam Hussein statue in the last war. There are pictures of present and former leaders on money. Of course, under former monarchies, each new ruler would coin their own money to show that they owned it all. In America, this is much more abstract, but it is just as real. Instead of a single person in whom we place our trust, we pledge our allegiance to a flag, to a symbol, to an intangible feeling and ideology. And so wherever this flag flies, our hearts are stirred to recall this feeling and set of beliefs. So we are familiar with how a political image works. Its very presence signifies dominion over that territory. In the ancient worlds, the gods worked in a very similar way. In order to signify the presence of a deity in a place, people would make images of that god. We modern people tend to think that ancient people actually worshipped the wood or the stone or the metal of the idol. But this is actually rather unfair to the ancient people. The Athenians, for example, did not believe that the statue of Athena Nike was Athena herself, but just that the statue represented her. The statue was a stand-in for the real thing, a focal point of worship and sacrifice. And just as Americans stand and salute a piece of cloth, without believing they are doing honor to the cloth or to the dye of which it's made, so an ancient person used an idol to worship an unseen God beyond the statue. The story of the golden calf is another excellent example of this. When the Israelites feel that God is far away because Moses represented God to them, and he had gone up on Mount Sinai for quite some time, they got worried and concerned. They needed God to be near them. They wanted the tangible presence of God. And so they brought their gold to Aaron, the priest, who was Moses' brother. And Aaron makes for them a golden calf. And Aaron says to them, "Behold, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt." You see, it wasn't most likely a calf, but a bull. The bull was an ancient symbol for quite a number of gods in the Mediterranean area, because the bull symbolizes power and abundance. The bull is a powerful beast who is able to father numerous calves by numerous cows, and so it's a fertility symbol, a symbol of abundance. It's also the strongest animal with which they would have been acquainted. But the book of Exodus calls it a calf. Perhaps this is mocking, making something strong into something quite weak. The Israelites, they didn't believe that God was a bull or a calf, but that the bull carries the same kind of qualities and ideas that they think God had. Someone who is powerful and able to make things fertile. And in the ancient world, the kings and the pharaohs and Caesar thought they were an image of God or the gods on earth. Some of them, like the Pharaoh and Caesar, even believed themselves to be gods. It is in this context that we should understand what it means to be in the image of God. For centuries, Christians have thought that the image of God referred to something within human nature, that we share some aspect of our nature with God. There are dozens of things Christians have tried throughout generations to find in humans that make us like God in some way. Love, reason, compassion, creativity, community, language, power, knowledge, etc. But the problem with this kind of thinking is that it usually goes from ourselves to God, and then back again in a circle. We say, well, animals don't seem to have reason, but we do. Therefore, God, who is greater than us, must be even more rational. God is the perfect rational being, and we must image him in our own reason. But that kind of thinking, which is so common in both philosophical and popular thinking, is problematic. You see, we begin with ourselves. We identify what we like about ourselves. And we make God to be like that, but better and perfect. And then we forget that we started with ourselves in the first place, so that we imagine we must be like God in some way. This is circular reasoning at its worst. It's making a God in our own image and then forgetting that we didn't. To understand the image of God, we have to begin with God himself. And as we've said, we cannot know about God through the things he's made, through tradition or through reason, but only through the story he's given us in the Bible. So to understand what the image of God is, we have to begin with God. And when God makes humans in his image, he does so by giving them dominion over his creation. You see, the image of God is not about nature or being, but about representation. It's about a political image. Whereas other gods had representatives in stone or wood or metal, our God made representatives of himself in Adam and Eve. And so God says, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over everything that creeps on the earth. God's command to humankind is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. What God is doing here is delegating his lordship over creation to his human creatures. The image of God is therefore having this delegated authority, or having dominion. God is making humans to be in a certain kind of relationship with him and with the creation. Humans are to bear the image of God to the creation. They are to rule over it. But this is not the kind of rulership that people tend to think about now. It's not about exploitation. It's not about viewing the earth as a combination of resources to be taken advantage of. The kind of relationship that we have with God determines the kind of relationship we have with others. All right, I'll say it again. The kind of relationship that we have with God determines the kind of relationship that we have with one another and with the creation itself. So the dominion Adam and Eve expressed over the creation was the exact same kind of dominion that the Creator had with his creation. They were expressing his will through their relationship with the creation. And we know that God cares about each and every individual sparrow. He's not interested in preserving species for scientific interest. But he's interested in each individual being because God delights in his own creatures individually. And this shows when Adam is given a parade of animals to name in Genesis 2. We assume that this means that he named the species. So he saw a giraffe and he called that giraffe. He saw a lion and called it lion. He saw a bear and an eagle and called them by those names. But what if it actually meant that Adam named the animals individually, just as God knows our names individually? And God doesn't treat us as human. He treats us as you and me. We can see a similar kind of relationship between a pet and its master. No one names their dog, dog. No one names their horse, horse. That just feels strange. It feels like you're depersonalizing and creating distance between you and the animal. When you want some kind of closeness, you want a real relationship. And so you give them a personal name. And you expect them to call when you, to respond when you call to them by that name. The kind of dominion that Adam had over the animals is kind and personal. And the relationship that Adam had with the land was very similar, as we will see next week. Not like the relationship we have with God's creation in these days. In the old days of monarchies, a king would have representatives spread throughout his land and throughout various other countries. These people would represent the will of the king to the people. A vicegerent, for such this position is called, would not replace the king, or even carry authority for himself, but would simply act as the king's presence when the king could not be there, or was not there. This is similar to what the image of God really means. Adam and Eve are in the creation as God's representatives. They exercise power on God's behalf, but it is not their own power that they are exercising. They don't have to train to become stronger, to rule over the more powerful beasts. They simply represent the power of God. And of course, in order to fulfill the task of being God's representative, God endowed his human creatures with the gifts they needed to rule over the creation. And so humans are intelligent and creative and social beings. Not because that is what God is like. Not because we are being just like God when we are knowledgeable or being rather social or being creative. But we have these traits because these are the traits necessary to rule over the creation and be God's representative in the creation. And one of the most interesting things I've noticed in Genesis 1 to 2, I haven't seen many people notice it, unfortunately, is that for the beginning of perhaps the world's most famous religious text of all time, there is no religion mentioned anywhere. Nowhere does God command worship, sacrifice, or prayer. There are no temples or priests. Other ancient creation stories say that humans were created to serve the gods, to offer them sacrifices, to feed them. But there is none of this in Genesis. Instead of humans offering God religious service, God includes Adam and Eve in his dominion over the creation. Religion is not God's intention and design for Adam and Eve. He did not make them so they could become sycophants. God did not create a bunch of whiny creatures who are needy all the time and have to come before him asking him for their daily needs. No, he provides them, and he created them to be rulers. Religion, as we will see, comes about because of a broken relationship with God. Not because it is our nature or our destiny to be religious. Religion is a kind of relationship. It's a relationship of distance. It's a relationship of mediation. You see, all our relationships go through kinds of mediation, through mediators. When you call a distant family member on the phone, your relationship is mediated and in many ways shaped and transformed by the telephone itself. The telephone means you cannot see facial expressions or nonverbal cues. Religion is similar. Religion implies distance. The only reason we pray is because we're absent from someone, because we entreat another to have mercy upon us. Religion bids us as come into the presence of the king. But there is none of this present in the image of God. Rather than the man and woman petitioning God, God delegates to them his own authority. In many ways, it's the opposite kind of relationship. Rather than stand apart and at a distance, God is nearby. Rather than receive sacrifices from groveling supplicants, God delivers gifts of responsibility and power. Religion places a screen between us and God, a veil to shield the glory of God from us, and to shield God from our own wretchedness. The image of God is a relationship with no mediation, nothing to come between God and his people. Instead, humans, in the creation story, humans mediate God's authority to the creation. Instead of needing the creation to approach God, the creation goes to God through people. It's the exact opposite kind of relationship we have now. And this, again, is why it's so important that we do not turn to nature to try to find God. As Paul says in Romans 1, Paul makes clear in Romans 1 that is a product of sin. That turning and worshiping nature in order to worship God is the product of a broken relationship with God. But before we begin to think that I'm saying that we shouldn't pray or that we're meant to be conquerors over creation, we must again remember that this understanding of the image of God comes within the context of our big story that we've been talking about. So far, we've said that this big story, that this story begins with God, and God is its main character. I've said that it's like a biography and not a history of events. Like a biography, we see the development of characters through events rather than concentrating on the events themselves and the characters being kind of secondary. So we have also seen that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is the Trinity, and that our knowledge of him must work through the whole story rather than just selecting this or that scene from the story. We saw that creation is about revealing God as the creator, rather than telling us scientific facts about human and universal origins. We've seen all that, and now we begin to see God interact with humans in a particular way. This shows us who God is. He is a great and magnanimous ruler. He shares his power, not because he needs helpers, but because he is so rich in power that it is his delight to share it. A ruler has slaves when he cannot afford the time or the effort or the ability to take care of tasks that can be delegated. But a strong king is able to do all things for himself, to lead from the front, as it were, but nevertheless chooses to share his power with the lords and ladies of his kingdom. But this is not an eternal reality based in some kind of human nature. God is eternal, but this kind of relationship that we have between Adam and Eve and God is not eternal. As we will talk about in a few weeks' time, we must encounter Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve fall from God's grace. The fall changes everything, not because it corrupts human nature so much, but because it transforms the kind of relationship that exists between God and his people. No longer are they lords and ladies, ruling according to the manner of a king. Instead, they become wretches, who nevertheless possess the ability to dominate God's creation. And because of this, they become rebels. They become usurpers of God's power. They become alternative kings. And so they exercise God's rightful dominion wrongly against him. But we get ahead of ourselves. For now, we must concentrate on the magnanimity of God, rather than on the glory of what it means to be human. For that's what the image of God is about. It's not about human glory, but about the magnanimity of our God. For what it means to be human, for what it means for us to be human, is entirely determined by the kind of relationship that we have with God, not based on any intrinsic qualities in ourselves. God's magnanimity does not change throughout our story, because God does not change. But as we will see in the progression of the story, magnanimity transforms into mercy and grace as the relationship between God and his people is poisoned. So we can begin to see what a great God we have, who in the beginning does not want worshipers, who does not want service, who does not want people to grovel at his feet. Instead, we have a different message from that of human religiosity. In the beginning, God created man and woman in his image. He established a royal charter, a relationship of shared power. God created rulers to rule with him. What a high position it is then from which Adam and Eve will fall. And what an elevation we can have by reconciliation with God in Christ, who promises that we shall reign with him in his glory when he comes into the fullness of his kingdom. That is not yet, of course, is not yet come to fulfillment. Now look around you. In this very room are images of various kinds. There are American flags representing the power of our government, pervading the walls of church, inciting within our hearts feelings of pride in our nation and in the ideals for which it stands. There is a cross behind me and one before me, representing the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ for us. And there are a few dozen other images in front of me. What do they represent? What do you represent? Whom do you image? Shall you be the image of human glory, the rebellious powers that usurp God's dominion for themselves? Or will you image the humility and love of Christ? Will you be an idol for the world or an idol for God? For that's what it means to be an image. Jesus says, "Let your light shine before others." In a way he's saying, let others see that you are God's image, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father